I struck the Variety Reach from the chart on the 43rd day after the fleet came home. Not destroyed. That is the part you have to hold in your mind before I tell you the rest. The Variety 7th Fleet was not destroyed. It came back. Every hull intact, every crew manifest accounted for, engines cycling at standard cruise efficiency, running lights on. It crossed back through the boundary marker at Velos 9 outpost in clean formation, matched the harbour beacon without deviation, and docked in sequence. 41 vessels. 11,207 crew. I am the senior cartographer of the Thalassian Mapping Authority. I have held that post for 31 years. In that time I have struck 2 sectors from the official chart. One was the Drev corridor, which collapsed into a stellar body that no longer warrants navigation, a purely physical erasure. The other was the Orondas Annex, which a species called the Kaladi had ceased to occupy, by choice or by circumstance. We still do not know which, because no one went to ask. That was 19 years ago, and no one has asked since. The Variety Reach is the third. It is the only one I have struck because of what came back from inside it. Let me tell you what I know about the line at human space. Every cartographer of my generation learned it the same way, not in the formal curriculum, but from the senior archivist who trained us, in a room exactly like this one, on an evening when the lesson had run long and the day's mapping was done. Our archivist was a flat-faced, dry-voiced Palathene named Hesevrath, and he had held the senior post for 40 years before I inherited it. He did not lecture. He simply walked to the sector display and pointed at the region designated in our charts as the outer null, the long band of empty space that runs spinward of the galactic median, and he said, "That is not empty. It looks empty because of the designation." The designation is a professional courtesy extended to every species in the Accord by the Mapping Authority, at the Accord's own request, 412 years ago. Before that request, the region was designated as it should be, inhabited, charted, flagged for approach caution. The Accord asked us to remove the inhabited designation. They did not ask us to remove it because no one lives there. They asked us to remove it because something does, and they wanted the chart to discourage approach, and an empty designation is quieter than a warning label that invites questions. So we removed it. And I was trained in the removal's meaning. And I carried that training for 31 years, and I assumed it would be enough, because every species that had ever come to us with a routing request near that band had taken one look at the outer null designation and rerouted without asking why. Every species until the Variety. The Variety are an old species. Not elder, not the kind whose silences wait, but old enough to have charted 100 campaigns, swallowed a dozen smaller civilizations into their reach, and developed a working theory of the galaxy that placed themselves at the center of it. Their 7th Fleet was their finest instrument of expansion. 41 ships of the line, built in the Verada fashion, broad hulls, heavy guns, crews trained for what they called decisive engagement. Their fleet admiral, a figure named in the Accord records as Tharvalosek, had a documented record of 11 successful territorial expansions over a career of 40 years. He was not a reckless officer. He understood the concept of acceptable loss and the calculus of strategic gain. He looked at the outer null designation on our charts, and he did what I had never seen a species do. He came to the authority directly and asked why it was blank. I was the one who answered. I told him the designation was a navigational artifact, that the region had been surveyed as resource poor and transit hostile, that no authority routing recommendation would place a fleet inside it. He listened to this with the flat patience of a man who has heard careful language before and knows what it conceals. He asked me, specifically, if the region was inhabited. I told him, specifically, that the authority's chart carried no inhabited designation for the outer null. He thanked me and left. I reported the conversation to the Accord's secretariat the same day. They told me there was nothing to be done. A species with Accord standing could route their own fleet where they chose, and the Accord had no authority to impose a travel restriction that would require disclosing the reason for the restriction. The outer null silence depended on its silence. If they filed the routing through their own navigation authority and not ours, we could not intervene. They filed it through their own navigation authority 22 days later. I know what the tracking stations recorded, because the Accord gave me access to the full telemetry before they sealed it. The 7th Fleet crossed the designated boundary of the outer null at 0340 station standard on a day I will not put into this record. The tracking stations at Velos 9 and Keth Soreth received standard navigation pings from the fleet for the first 14 hours. Tharval Osek sent one transmission at hour 12, a routine position confirmation, nothing in the language to suggest alarm. Then the pings continued. Then, at hour 22, they stopped. Not a loss of signal. The tracking stations registered no distress frequency, no emergency beacon, no debris scatter, no mass shadow consistent with a hull breach. The pings simply stopped, as though the fleet had decided there was nothing further to report. The Accord Secretariat convened within the hour. I was not in that session, but I have the summary. They discussed, in order, a communications failure, a navigation anomaly, a decision by Fleet Admiral Osek to maintain signal silence for tactical reasons, and a fourth possibility that the record shows was raised and then struck from the official minutes. I know what the fourth possibility was because the archivist who trained me had told me about the last time it had been raised. I will not write it here either. For 21 days the tracking stations received nothing. The Accord issued no public statement. The Varadi government filed 2 formal inquiries and received 2 formal acknowledgements. The Mapping Authority was asked to review its charts of the region for any anomaly that might explain a communications interruption. We reviewed them. The charts showed what they had always shown, empty space. On the 8th day of the silence, the Accord quietly repositioned the Kethsareth tracking station, the one closest to the outer null boundary, to a wider monitoring orbit. They told the station commander it was a routine calibration adjustment. I know from the authority's liaison record that the real reason was that Kethsareth had, on day 6, begun receiving a signal from inside the null that the station's own communications officer could not classify. Not the Varadi fleet's navigation frequency. Not any frequency in the Accord's registered spectrum. The commander was instructed to log it as interference and adjust the station's position until the signal fell outside receiver range. The log entry was revised before I saw it. I know what it originally said because the liaison officer told me, and then stopped telling me things, and then was no longer in the liaison role. I did not press further. I am a cartographer. The chart does not record what the instruments cannot classify. On the 21st day, Velo's 9 outpost picked up navigation pings again. The 7th Fleet came back in clean formation. 41 ships. Speed, heading, and drive output within normal parameters. No damage signatures. The harbour controller at Velo's 9 cleared them for approach because there was nothing in the telemetry to refuse. They docked in sequence. The harbour crew extended the boarding walkways. The crews were at their posts. All 11,207 of them. Sitting in their chairs, standing their watches, occupying the positions their duty manifests required them to occupy. Alive, breathing, physically unharmed by every measure the Accord medical team applied in the first 2 hours. They did not speak. Not a single member of the 7th Fleet's crew, officer, enlisted, engineering or medical staff, the Fleet Admiral himself, produced a word.
No borrati vocalizations.
No distress calls, no requests for assistance, no responses to direct questions. The harbour controller's initial log entry reads, and I am rendering this from memory because the original has been transferred to a facility whose location I am not permitted to record. All crew present and physically responsive. No communication received. Crew appear to be waiting. Waiting. That was the word she used. The Accord medical team worked for 18 days. They found no neurological injury in any standard scan. They found no chemical agent in the blood work. They found no evidence of physical trauma. What they found, and what I know because a colleague in the authority's Health Liaison Division told me before she was reassigned, was a consistent anomaly in the deep structure memory processing of every crew member examined. Not a lesion. Not a deletion. Something that looked, to the specialists, less like damage and more like rewriting. On the 19th day, one crew member spoke. She was a junior navigation officer, 23 years of age, whose duty station had been the helm of the fleet's 2nd ship. She spoke for 4 minutes and 11 seconds in a session with a single Accord Secretariat interpreter. The interpreter's transcript was sealed within the hour. I have not read the transcript, but I know one thing she said, because the interpreter told a colleague, and that colleague told another, and the chain is short enough that I trust it. She said, "They showed us what they remembered." That was all she said that made sense. After 4 minutes and 11 seconds she stopped, and she did not speak again, and within another 8 days not a single crew member of the 7th Fleet produced any communication in any format. The Accord transferred them the following week. To where, and under what conditions, the record does not say, and I have not asked, because I am a cartographer and not an official of the Secretariat, and some knowledge is not mine to seek. I was asked to handle the chart revision. That is why I am the one telling you this. The accord needed the variety reach struck from the official record, the sector boundaries redrawn to close the gap, the outer null designation extended to cover the approach corridors the variety fleet had used. They needed a senior authority signature on the revision. Mine is the only one in the building with sufficient standing. So they brought the chart to me, and I sat with it for a long time before I touched it. I have been a cartographer for 31 years. I believe in the record. I believe that a chart is an honest document, that it carries what is there, and only what is there, and that the map's silence about a thing should mean the thing is not present. The outer null designation offends me professionally, and it has offended me since the day Hessevrath explained it to me, because it is a lie in the language of cartography, and cartographers do not tell lies. We tell omissions when the accord requires it. I have made my peace with the difference, which is to say I have not made my peace with it, but I have lived beside it long enough that the discomfort is familiar. But I drew the new boundary. I extended the outer null to cover the corridors. I signed the revision. And I transferred the prior variety reach designation from the active chart to the sealed archive, where it will sit until the Accord's Secretariat determines that it is safe to acknowledge, which means it will sit there indefinitely. I have one more thing to say, and then I am going to close this record. The interpreter who spoke with the navigation officer was reassigned to a post outside the Accord's core systems. She is, as far as I know, well. But before she left, she told her colleague one more thing than the sentence I already gave you. She said the navigation officer had not looked frightened when she spoke. She had not looked damaged or confused or traumatized in any register the interpreter knew how to read. She had looked like someone who had been shown something very large and had not yet decided whether to describe it. They showed us what they remembered. I do not know what humans remember. I know what the chart says, which is nothing, because the chart says the outer null is empty. I know what 3 decades of professional training says, which is that you do not approach a region whose only navigation note is the consistent absence of every ship that enters it. I know what a senior Accord archivist told me in a quiet room when the day's work was done, which is more than I am putting into this document. What I know, specifically, is this: the Variety 7th Fleet was not destroyed. It came home. And the thing that is worst about that is not the silence, and it is not the rewriting, and it is not the sealed transfer to a facility whose location is unlogged. It is that the ships were in clean formation, matching the harbour beacon without deviation. Running lights on, exactly as they had left 41 days prior, except for the one thing I have not said and will not say, the one detail in the harbour controller's second-hour log, the entry that precedes the one about the crew waiting, the entry that was also transferred before I could read it in full. I saw the first 2 lines. I drew the new boundary. I signed the revision. I am closing this record now.